Thanks for joining me this morning, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while in the making. This is all my fault. We are here because your wonderful brother, who I'm buddies with up here in New York and we served together with, said, "Listen, you need to talk to my sister because um, Venezuela is a key issue here in the hemisphere, and she's the expert, and you need to talk to her so she can educate you." And I said, "Perfect, Pat. Let's do it that way." And so I really appreciate you taking the time and coming
Yeah,
on
sure.
and helping me understand and everybody else who listens here understand. And this is going to be great because so many soldiers here in New York listen. A lot of them intel soldiers, and we focus so much on what's happening in Russia and China and Iran and Israel for obvious reasons. But we can't lose sight of the other, let's call it conflicts that are and crises even that are, close to home. And so let's talk about that. So why are we here in the first place? What do you do for your profession specifically, and how do you spend your time, and why are you going to ensure I'm tracking on all things Venezuela today?
Well, first thing, I'm a proud Venezuelan American. I was, of course, born in the United States, but I lived in Venezuela for 20 years. I have all my family in Venezuela at the moment. And since I came back to the United States because of political persecution, I was working in a municipality. I was deputy mayor in a municipality in the capital city of Caracas. Anyone who's opposition in Venezuela today or is in exile or is in asylum or is in jail or is in hiding. That's the reality of when you live under a dictatorship or a regime like the Maduro regime. So I had to back to the United States where my baby brother took me in for a couple of months. And now I've been supporting CSIS, which is one of the number one think tanks in DC, just to continue, creating awareness around what's happening in Venezuela and why it's a top Western Hemisphere topic. I feel like when we think of conflicts around the world, of course, we think of Israel and Palestine. Of course, we think of Ukraine and Russia. Of course, we think of North Korea and, so many other enemies. But to be honest, in Venezuela today, there is a geographical hotspot of U.S. enemies who are just creating more and more pressure to the United States. And it's 3 hours away from Miami. So I think Venezuela is a top issue at the moment because you see a lot of allies from the regime, such as Russia, such as Cuba, such as Iran, such as China, just making their way of creating more pressure towards the United States. So it should be on top of mind for everyone at the moment.
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. When you were, so I'm interested. We talked a little bit on the last episode about the history of Venezuela. I tried to provide a little bit of a foundation, and of course, Caracas is involved there heavily, specifically because Bolivar was born there, and then it's obviously the capital. So, but when you were there, what were you doing? Kind of a day-to-day life, like what were your responsibilities like? I know you said that you were involved in politics. You were deputy mayor, but what did that look like while you were there?
Well, it was, we were in office for 4 years. I became deputy mayor because our mayor was forced to exile. He was a huge opposition leader. He had an arrest warrant, so he had to flee the country. So I became deputy mayor because of that critical circumstance. And a lot of it was just making sure that our municipality was safe. We had one of the highest rates of criminality and of kidnapping of the whole city, which we were able to decrease exponentially, was making sure that our hospitals and our schools were functioning. During the years of 2016 and 2017, there was a humanitarian crisis, which you probably already kind of read and heard about, of how there was no food, of how there's hyperinflation, of how there's a scarcity of medicines and medical equipment, and people were doing everything in their power to survive and to bring food to the table. I mean, I was first witness of seeing how our population in schools would decrease just because parents preferred to let their kids continue sleeping instead of waking them up and taking them to school because they had no breakfast at all at home. So like it was that bad what Venezuela continues to go through, and how people are just trying to do everything in their power to bring food to the table and to keep their families alive. So being a government official and during those times, and an opposition government official, which was even more complicated because the regime would do anything to go against you and to persecute you and to force you to exile. They were very tough times, and we were just local government. So imagine the impact that we had over $100,000 people population was really something that we went to work every single day, even though we didn't have major resources like the government or anything else, just to make people's lives better. So it was a very, very, very gratifying experience. Probably one of the best experiences I've had so far. But yes, that's what happens when you're a public servant, just like you in New York or my brother. You're passionate and you're convinced that doing better for people is what you need to do. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And for context, for those listening here in the upstate New York region, 100,000, that's about the size of Albany. So if you were to combine like Albany, Schenectady, Troy, and all the outlying towns and villages and stuff, we're about 1 million here in the Capital District. But if you're looking at just the city of Albany, it's 100,000. So you can imagine
100,000 people with a budget that was less than $1 million. So imagine.
Yeah, I mean, that's silly. How do you accomplish anything?
That's roads, that's police, that's schools, that's education, that's everything. So
yeah, it's non-functional almost in a way, right? Almost.
Yep.
So what was it like working with the other civic functions, right? Like, so you're in the opposition party. Obviously, there are personalities and there are servants that are not supporting you, right? That are part of the regime. And so what was it like to try and contact and work with these other civic functions? And they were like, no, we're good. I'm not interested in what you need, right? Or this side of the city because we're part of the regime. What kind of struggle was that like every day?
Yeah, it was impossible to work with the national government. I mean, it was impossible to get support from the national government. It was even impossible to get support from the regional government because it was also Chavista or Maduro, inclined party. So what we did, we went for public-private partnerships across the board. Like we worked with NGOs, we worked with academia, we worked with corporate companies, we worked with any entrepreneur, like any person who was willing and able to support us to continue working as a local government was so crucial. And I think a lot of what we did from like the social side, from education, from health, from social development, from all the programs that we had for families and for kids and everything else were thanks to public-private partnerships because people wanted to continue giving back to their communities, wanted to have better communities around them because they wanted that, social license to operate and impact. And they would just reach out. And we had amazing credibility because what we were able to do with such little budget and with such a horrible kind of situation, people would always reach out. And they would, even if it were like, neighbors of, they would just organize themselves in a neighborhood and say, hey, we want to help you go buy tires for police officers and for police cars. So like that was one of the greatest things of being Venezuelan because people are going to continue to fight for what's right. And they're going to continue to find ways to support people who are doing the right thing. So that was important.
Yeah. Outstanding. What was it like from a security standpoint, right? Like you wake up every day, you're getting ready to go to work, you've got to drive, however you're going to get to work and do what you're going to do and then go home at night. Was that a challenge for you specifically every day? I mean, you're constantly
100%. I mean,
looking.
So Caracas was one of them. Was one of the most unsafe, cities of the world. As I said before, kidnapping was the norm, especially in our municipality because we had a lot of wealthier families in our municipality. So a lot of those kind of irregular groups or illicit groups would come to our municipality to kidnap people. I wanted to say that we had, I don't know, about 9-10 kidnappings a week, if you can think about it. And then we were able to reduce that number to like 1 or 2. And sometimes there were weeks with none because we were able to strengthen the police. We were able to institutionalize the police, give them the resources that they needed. And a lot of neighbors chipped in for that. So yes, we had a local government in one of the most criminal, moments of not only of the city, but also the regime. We can't forget that the regime is a mafia, narco, cartel state, which, terrorism of state is a policy, persecution of opposition leaders is a policy, where bringing the military and creating them into a drug cartel is a policy of state. So it was very complex to be able to navigate all of that. But thank God we were able to create like strides within our local government. And we were able to show that, if you really institutionalize the police and give them what they need and give them the training, give them the resources, your municipality can be safe, like ours became safe. So it was far, far, far complex. And then if you add to that the fact that you were opposition and the regime would do everything in its power to come and persecute you or to come and go against your family or go against your other team members in the municipality. They would have their own, intelligence units circle our municipality, circle our offices. You would have your own kind of mayor in clandestinity for 35 days, fleeing the country. They did everything in their power to make sure that we couldn't operate. And we showed them that we could, and we did for 4 years straight. So
that's awesome. What about the well, first of all, I'm glad to know that you're here and that you're safe and that you didn't run into any crazy scenarios. And you didn't end up as one of those 9. Jesus, the thought of that. But I had read, as I was doing research for our discussion and then some of the history stuff we did last week, that at one point Maduro's numbers nationally, and again, we'll take this with a grain of salt, right, was potentially down to like 20% in support of him. So they're giving the impression that there's a lot of people that really don't like the guy, and potentially he's just in power because he is so strong and he's based, he's utilizing the environment that was first established by Chavez, and then now he's taking over, right? So, but what was that like for you on an individual, in a local basis, right? When you were trying to do what you were doing, did you find that there were a lot of people who were supporting, but you couldn't get anything done because of the way that the local government was constructed, right? And all the hurdles?
I mean, no one supports Maduro nowadays. It's the truth. Okay. And even back then as well. Yes, he has a very small base, maybe, of people who are absolutely loyal, but the majority of people know what Maduro represents. They know that he represents corruption. They know that he represents hyperinflation. They know he represents poverty. Let's not forget that 3 of 4 people in Venezuela are in extreme poverty. That's 75% of the population. That's people who can't bring food to the table. That's people who can't send their kids to school. It's people who can't get medicine. And this is across the board. Like, these many people say, oh, well, the military is so adept to Chavez and to Maduro and everything else. It's also the military and those kind of like mid and lower ranks who are also having these same people that common people are having. It's people not having food and water and electricity at home. Like, let's not forget that the Maduro regime, in order to kind of create more of this terrorism state, decides to shut down electricity for 1 or 2 days or even weeks. It's people who don't have clean water at home. So I think people know what Maduro represents. And I think that's the reason why people have been fleeing. You can't forget, John, that it's been 8 million people who have left the country since 2015. And that number is just going to continue to increase if he does not leave power, if he does not give peacefully a transition in January, when he's supposed to do that with the newly president-elect Edmundo González Urrutia. People are going to continue to flee. And guess what? That's going to impact the U.S. southern border first, because and it's going to continue to create an issue because people are coming to the United States and people are going to other countries in the region just to make a better living. It's not because people want to leave. So I think people know what Maduro represents, and that's why his popularity, especially after the July 28th election, just continues to plummet as much as possible.
Now, what is so let me, when I ask this question, and I don't want to ask it in a way that gives the impression, gives a negative connotation, all right? So, but knowing that the population is against Maduro in a large way, right? There's a large amount of people who clearly don't support him, as you're saying. Is the environment constructed in such a way where people who would want to oust him don't have the ability to do so? So in a similar way, in Iran, where there's a whole host of people that really do not like the regime in Tehran, but they just don't have the capacity given the security state. Is it similar in Venezuela, or is it because there are so few resources, it would be almost impossible for the populace to do something like that?
The biggest variable is that the populace does not have arms. So we are a very peaceful population, which we go to vote and we protest when we don't, when we want more important things. So I think that's the first variable. The people of Venezuela do not have arms. So it's going to be really hard to go against a regime and a government. And that's how it's been since 1999, because we've been through this for almost 25 years. And that's why we have not been able to oust Maduro, is because we don't have the ammunition or the arms to do so. And unfortunately, the military has not been on the side of justice. The military has not been on the side of making sure that they're respecting the will of the people who went to vote on July 28th. So I think it's going to be hard for just the Venezuelans by themselves to be able to do it. And I think that's why a lot of times the Venezuelans also look to the international community to find different ways in creating incentives for him to be ousted or to leave or to peacefully transition an election that he lost on January. So I think that's the issue that the Venezuelans are having, and we only know of flags and posters, and we don't know of guns and ammunition. So that's why it's been hard for us to do it, and that's why we're always looking for the international community just to create more ways for him to leave as soon as possible. Because if not, the Venezuelan country the people in Venezuela will just leave first. So it's going to just create more turmoil, not just for the region, but also for the hemisphere and the rest of the world. So
yeah. Do you think there's a number that would leave Venezuela, enough of a number that would convince Maduro to change some of his behavior so he could at least have somebody that he's going to be leading? No,
he is more inclined to keeping his terror state and making sure that all the people who oppose him leave. That's why I said at the beginning, or people are in exile, or people are in jail, or people are not in the country anymore, or people are in asylum. His always from the very beginning, if you do not like how we do things here, I will put you in jail or you can go. So I think he will continue. And I do think that mass migration for him is a policy of state, because that's the way he creates pressure on the United States. And that's the way he creates pressure on the regime. You want to come and put sanctions on me? I'm going to send you more people to your backyard. So I do think that there's not a number that will change him, especially because his biggest incentive is staying in power. He doesn't want to renounce power. He has a state which is fled by corruption and by drug trafficking. He's getting the revenue he needs to continue doing whatever he needs to do. He is being right now investigated for crimes against humanity. Imagine in the International Criminal Court, he's being investigated for crimes against humanity. Believe me, this man has no limits, and nor anyone in his regime has limits. So I don't think there's a number. I think it benefits him for the majority of Venezuelans to flee so that he can just stay in power for as long as he wants.
Do you think there's an irony in that his strategy, as you had said, it's a policy of state for these people he's not interested in to continue to leave, and then eventually they'll make it their way to the United States, or some stay in Mexico, wherever they're going, but it becomes a political issue for the United States, obviously, in what am I trying to say? A direct political issue, right? Because it's right in your face. You're coming over the border. This isn't just a strategic political issue where the United States is looking at the entire hemisphere and looking at stability. We're talking about, Venezuelans who are searching for a better life, obviously crossing the border, and it finds that this issue finds itself in the presidential campaigns and all these other things. So do you think there's an irony in that him doing that will push the United States to such a point where we may step in some way that removes him from power?
I mean, the United States has already stepped in a little bit with sanctions, with indictments. Just a couple days ago, two Republican senators, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, wanted to raise the amount of the reward on Maduro's head from $50 million to $100 million to anyone who would give information on him or his capture or anything else. So the United States has taken some action. But I do think there could be so much more. And John, that's a question that I would love to ask you. What else can the United States do, for example, for counterintelligence? What else can the United States do to be more aggressive with drug trafficking? Let's not forget that, El Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of Suns, it's called that way because it's controlled by Maduro and by the National Guard, and it's all the guards who have the suns on their uniform, right? What else can the United States do to counterattack all of that and to counterattack the influence and not let Russia and China and Cuba and Iran have such a huge geopolitical hotspot? I feel like the Venezuelans have done what we can. I feel that the United States has taken some actions, but I would love for them to be more and to create the incentives for him to go. So I kind of want to ask you, what do you think from a military or defense perspective? What else needs to happen? What other ideas are there?
Well, I think I would say this. Now, I have some interesting background here because I spent a few years as a counter-narcotics analyst at the DEA. and worked for the National Guard counter drug program, and now obviously is the J2 for New York. So, working with Southcom on their issues throughout their region. So, I'll give you one example. I have a friend of mine who worked as a local police officer, but he's a task force officer for the DEA here locally, and
Mhm.
he's done some pretty large cases throughout South America and has actually been in Peru doing stuff. So, why do I say that? Because it's the U.S. law enforcement / military community is involved in doing counter narcotics stuff throughout South America, and Venezuela is one of those places. Um, Venezuela is more challenging in that the security environment creates a difficult place to operate. It's not as challenging as other places, but you know how often and how long and how many people we've had involved in Colombia for narcotics issues for a very long time.
Yep.
So it is an effort, but I would say that the narcotics world is a real challenge because of, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but ultimately there's a use issue. And as long as there's going to be a use issue, then it's going to be exceptionally hard to overturn the entire enterprise, especially when it's backed by nation state dollars. And that's happening in Colombia. We can't stop cocaine coming from Colombia. If we wanted to, we would literally just have to build a wall 100 feet tall and never let anybody in. And the U.S. is just not going to do that. Now, with that being said, I'm agreeing with you in that the U.S. has put effort here, but does that mean that we're putting enough effort? I mean, probably not. Could we put more effort in? Sure. Could we spend more dollars? Could we send more DEA agents to Venezuela? Can we send more agents down into South America? Could we do more wires? Could we send more assets? Can we do more collection? Sure. I'm sure we could do all those things, but that gets into the conversation you and I had this week while we were texting back and forth in preparation is there's an element within Washington that is balancing foreign policy priorities often in a very calculated way. And what's happening in China and Russia and Israel right now happens to be on the top of the priority list. And sometimes there's just not enough dollars to go around. And so they prioritize Venezuela. It's not like people are ignoring it. It's just like, what's that?
I just feel that, sorry to interrupt you. I know that there are so many other issues on the geopolitical priority list, but I feel that from the United States perspective, resolving Venezuela is probably one of the easiest. It's just creating incentives for a dictator to leave. It's going to be so hard to resolve Russia and Ukraine in the short term. It's going to be so hard to resolve Israel and Palestine in the short term. Let's not even talk about China, but creating incentives for this man who lost an election because he only got 30% of the votes. 70% of the votes were done by President-elect Edmundo González Urrutia, and making sure that he's giving whatever things he needs for him to go and to restore Venezuela back into democracy is going to be an easier, quicker win than any of the other conflicts around the world. So that's what I question, because I feel that we can restore democracy in Venezuela much easier than any of the other geopolitical conflicts.
Interesting. I don't. That's a
and
great
also,
point.
sorry to interrupt you again. It's probably going to be an easier, quicker win if you're looking at it from a campaign perspective. You want to bring in the U.S. election involved. There's 40 days left for this election, and whatever this current administration do or the next administration can do, a quick win within 100 days of government in January of bringing back democracy, bringing back the president-elect of Venezuela, and making sure that Maduro and his cronies leave. I just think it's something to think about. That's all.
So that's a great point, right? You can take out the low-hanging fruit, right? And I can see how that would be an easy win, again, politically, as you stated, right? Like if the Harris campaign came out and said, listen, you know what's also an issue is Venezuela, and we need to bring this to top of mind, as you had said, and Maduro's got to go, and I pledge that when I become president, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to get Maduro out. I can see how you would maybe flip some votes there, and it could be beneficial. And I again, I hate to be calculating in that sense because it is a political move, but nonetheless, what would being from Venezuela and living there and knowing the environment and knowing Maduro the way that you do, what would some of those incentives look like? for example, I remember reading, and again, preparation for the show here, that I don't remember the year, 2016, maybe 2019, when the U.S. aid, they sent a whole bunch of food down to Colombia, right on Cucuta, was right on the border, and then Maduro came out and fired tear gas at everybody, didn't let any of the food in, and the food rotted.
Yep.
And his argument was that was some underhanded CIA campaign where we were trying to get the military to flip and then push Maduro out, blah, blah, blah. So it didn't work. Got it.
Yep.
And unfortunately, none of that food ever went to the Venezuelan people, which ultimately was, I would have loved to have seen. I think anybody else would have. But what would those incentives look like? We can't go in like we would have, or we did in 53, and we took out the leadership in Iran, right? Which ended up leading to the revolution in 79. So, 70, 80 years ago, we could have just made some decisions with some of our more clandestine operatives, and Maduro wouldn't be there anymore. We don't operate that way. So from your perspective, what are some of the things we could do?
Just giving him safe haven in any other country of the world to him and his cronies, and finding a way.
Just giving him. I'm sorry. So just giving him money, and maybe not money, but political asylum in a sense. Like, you can go over here.
Let's start by that. I mean, I would put that one as number one on the table. We can get more creative on other ones, but right. You probably saw in the news just recently, Spain gave asylum to the president-elect because he had an arrest warrant on his head. And all Venezuelans want our president-elect to be as safe and as, we want him to be in the best conditions available. But why didn't Spain give asylum to the guy who has to go? Do you know what I mean? Like, let's start from that conception. You put the wrong man in the plane at the end of the day. You should have given asylum to Maduro and told him, hey, like, you lost this election. It's time to go. Pick up your bags, pick up your favorite toys, and let's leave. You know what I mean? And that was not even the case. Spain decided to give asylum to our president-elect instead of maybe creating the conditions and the incentives for him to stay. So that's where I feel like let's start with that first option of giving him, hey, what will it take for you to go and to just let the new president-elect come into power and to restore democracy? I'm not sure if anyone has given that proposal on the table yet. So I'd start there.
Yeah, interesting perspective. It's almost like, in a very simplistic way would be, don't protect the good guy, protect the bad guy, which in a short term, it may seem like the wrong thing to do, right? Like, why would you protect the bad guy? But ultimately that makes it for a better place for Venezuela in the long run, right? And let this knucklehead live in Spain and do what he's going to do, where he has the ability to affect so many fewer people than he's clearly doing in Venezuela.
Yeah, and Spain is a perfect example of how they protected the bad guy. They let the bad guy stay. Our president-elect was threatened and he was coerced in leaving. Spain was a conduit to that, and they put him on a plane and they told him to leave. So once again, like, maybe we should just start from that simplistic point, would be my point.
Yeah, and Spain, obviously, going back historically, should be the one responsible. I mean, they're the ones that created the problems from a colonial perspective, right? So, this is your lineage, and so you help deal with this problem. It's not the United States per se, their issue to deal with. You got to step in and deal with it. So I'm at least at that level, I'm glad the Spanish government is at least recognizing that historical lineage and a responsibility to help. I don't think it's been the best help, but sure. It's there. So I can see what you're saying. What I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it looks like, given the small amount of support for Maduro, it's becoming pretty clear throughout the masses, if you will, that he's the bad guy and creating the problems. That it doesn't look like we have I'm speaking here from a U.S. State Department /DOD perspective, that there's not a power vacuum concern. That potentially could be the case in Iran, for example, because there are a lot of people that still support the regime. And so I don't know if we could, I don't want to call it manipulate, but create an environment where the good guys can step in pretty cleanly. It looks as if that would not be a problem in Venezuela, right? There's a very strong opposition force. Clearly, there are a lot of people like yourself and your colleagues who understand how to run a democratic government. Venezuela, not all that long ago, did have free and fair elections in 1947. It's the last time that they had them, but they did have that. So, and there is a democratic lineage to Venezuela. It's just, it hasn't been forever that it's been quote unquote socialist and been run by these knuckleheads that have been around. So
25 years.
Yeah. So it's not, so it wouldn't be that issue, right? So I could see where, the State Department saying, well, I don't really want to step in because we could ultimately create more chaos, which is always a concern when you're dealing with national security issues and foreign policy.
But at the same time, like, think of it from the U.S. perspective. Think of the elections of 2020, where President Trump, we all know, didn't want to go, right? So, and imagine he would have not let gone. He would have stayed. And Biden, who would have won the election, and when had the results and what we call in Venezuela, the access to show that he won the election, would have not allowed him to take in power on January. So, like, why? This is where I come back to United States stance. We can't allow that to happen in a country as peaceful as Venezuela. So why can't we be more stronger than just, statements? I feel like, the U.S. administration has done a lot to support the Democratic cause. And thank God the Democratic cause is bipartisan, by the way, is both Democrat and Republican. That's one of the biggest strengths of our cause in the United States. But, like, what are we going to do in January when this man really does not pick up his bags and go? Like how President Trump left in January. So that's where we can't allow for neutrality, I think, is my borderline. Like, we need to make sure that we're recognizing the president-elect, that we're giving him all the resources he needs in order to be able to assume power peacefully and to allow for a transition. And I think the countries of the world just can't be, oh yes, we recognize that Maduro lost the elections and didn't do anything else. They really have to recognize the president-elect, recognize that he won, and do everything in their power to make sure that he can take position and take the government in January. And I think that's why you're thinking of it from the State Department policy, but it's the same exact thing if it would have happened in the United States. It would have been crazy not to let President Biden come into power and to come into the White House and to come into government and to create his cabinet. That's what we're going to face in January. And I'm just hoping that the United States understands that really well so that it does not happen. That the worst thing that can happen is that nothing happens in January. So That's what we need to start preparing for right now.
Yeah. And I can see what you're saying. The United States obviously has a responsibility. It's taken upon itself a responsibility to try and ensure a stable hemisphere. First of all, we've done it globally since the end of World War II, but nonetheless, a stable hemisphere. And oftentimes the U.S. does kind of remain neutral in a sense, at least physically and operationally. But we will stand up and we'll say, this guy's a bad guy and didn't win the election, but we don't actually step in. Now, in the last episode, I talked about how, and forgive me for my pronunciation here, but the last president, when Maduro was considered an illegal leader because he didn't win the election, it was Guaido, right? Was how you pronounce that?
Yes.
Yeah. So he was actually brought into the United States, and he was given a round of applause in the halls of Congress when President Trump was in power, and recognized as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. At least that's how it was portrayed in the media. And yeah, so I'm supporting your argument in this sense by saying clearly the United States is not just placating the issue. They're actually making an operational move by bringing this guy into the halls of Congress and saying, no, we get it. You're the guy. So it is more of a concern than other countries, I guess I would say. So why not go further, right? Why not? If you've made that decision from a political standpoint to say Maduro's really bad and I'm going to bring the opposition guy here to meet the president, then why don't we just go the next step, right? And provide democracy in however way, right? With some coalition in whatever way we do it for Venezuela. I don't know if I have an answer to that question.
And if you don't, then you're going to get 1 million Venezuelans on the southern border by the end of next year. So I feel like it's just also part of U.S. interest. Migration's on the ballot right now within these elections. So, and that's the thing with Venezuelans. Like, let's not forget that Venezuelans want to go back home. I want to go back home. You know what I mean? Like, we want to go back home. We're here just under the circumstances. Let's not forget that, like, after the elections of July 28th, Maduro has already killed 25 people. He's incarcerated over 2,000 people. And of those 2,000 people, 150 are kids who are, going under torture, asphyxiated with plastic bags over their heads, who are going through sexual assault, who are going through electrical discharges. That not just said by me, said by the United Nations Human Rights Council last week. And now this week is going to be the UN General Assembly. We're going to be seeing a lot more of that. So international organizations are telling you that he's committing crimes against humanity. That's why people do not want to stay in that country, because they do not want to suffer torture or be a victim of those crimes. And I feel that if you remove Maduro from the equation and you remove his cronies and his state terrorism, people will want to come back to Venezuela. So maybe the issues that you're seeing in migration in the United States will probably continue to decrease. So that's why I'm kind of saying it's more of a quick win Venezuela than the other issues that we're having around the world.
Yeah, and you'll get no argument from me in regards to understanding the complexities of our immigration issues, and that these people that are coming across the border are not they're not riddled with terrorists, and they're not riddled with people who think the United States is just the absolute utopia of life. They're leaving because where they're coming from is going to lead to death, at least in this place. And they really don't want to have to cross all of these South American countries and make their way through Mexico and then find themselves in Texas. They don't want anything to do with that. So I argue that point all the time. You can imagine there's a lot of conservative folks within the military that don't necessarily take that viewpoint. They have a very pro-American view and say, well, why wouldn't they want to be here? It's America, duh, right? Well, that's, clearly that's
but also take into consideration there are 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia, almost a million in Brazil. So it's not like they're all coming to the U.S. southern border.
Yep.
They're also creating a huge influx in the rest of the region. And that also debilitates the rest of the region, because the rest of the region does not have the resources that they need in order to receive that influx. So what does that mean? The United States government, through USAID, through State Department, giving also additional resources to other countries around the world to help with the influx. So once again, we fully appreciate everything that the United States is doing to support the Venezuelans. But I feel like if you don't go to the root cause, you're going to be spending so much more money in this situation. So.
Yeah, you're, again, no argument for me on this point, right? Because I'm agreeing with you, or it should be obvious. I don't even have to agree, right? It's obvious that the majority of these people that are leaving where they're coming from is because of a safety issue, and they all want to go home, right? Like, I want to live in my home, and you want to live in your home, right? They're moving because they don't want to be taking their kids across the. Okay, we know this. So I support completely helping to create an environment where people can live where they were born in a safe way. And the answer is not building a 150-foot wall to just say, well, everybody go home. And if you don't get across, to me, it's nonsensical. And not just from a Statue of Liberty, we're going to take all of you here because we're a nation of immigrants standpoint, but from an actual diplomatic and national security standpoint, fewer people would be coming into the United States if they had an environment that was better for them. And, I get at times the counter argument from those that are a little bit more conservative that say, that's not necessarily the United States' responsibility. It's not our problem that Maduro is in charge. But that's so short-sighted. The United States took the mantle, whether we like it or not. And this is a conversation that I have with people that don't support the war in Ukraine at this point. Whether we like it or not, living here in 2024, our ancestors, quote unquote, our great-great-grandparents decided at the end of World War II that the United States was going to take the lead in global security. You might not like it, but we did that. And so since we've done that, we now have a continued responsibility, because the world operates with us and our allies in a way because we've created that stability. When we gave all that money back to Europe and we created our allies between us and Australia and Canada and whatever, New Zealand. So we don't get the opportunity now to just shut up shop and just say, listen, it's none of our business anymore. We want to go back to, pre-World War I days when we have no interest in anybody else, because now things happen like Russia invades Ukraine and China's going to go after Taiwan. And there are regimes in South America that are devastating their own people. You've taken the responsibility. You better keep it up. Figure out a way to pay for it. But it is what it is. And so I'm fully on board with that. You're not going to get any argument from me on that point. And listen, I don't want Pat to go home. I like him, but that's not my call, right?
Patrick, no, I think Patrick, you'll probably keep Patrick here. He's a public servant of this country, so you'll probably keep him here. But I would love for him to have the opportunity to go visit home and go or see our family. So that's what all Venezuelans want at the end of the day, and I think that was the key to success to this electoral campaign of Edmundo González Urrutia and María Corina Machado. Their value proposition was, we want to get into power to allow all of our friends and families and uncles and moms and dads and brothers and sisters to come back home. So, and people across the board can live with that, because after 8 million people fleeing, you have at least your best friend, your cousin, your sister, whatever, not living with you and not spending Christmas with you and not spending Thanksgiving with you and not being with you in birthdays. And that's, people just connected with that energy and connected with that thought. And that's why people are wanting this peaceful transition as much as possible, because they just want their families to come back home. So
yeah, understood.
that is their value proposition.
My understanding was that Venezuela is about 30 million, so 8 million left out of about 30. Do I have the numbers right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's a huge percentage. What does the what does Parliament look like today? I specifically didn't go and look at current numbers of stuff, right? All of these conversations, crime, all of these things within the last couple of years, because I wanted to ensure I had the right numbers in talking to you about it. So I did look at previous years, and I looked at, I want to say the last time Maduro came in was 18 to 19. I think he was seated in 19. But at one point, I think it was the election prior, he had lost to the opposition pretty dramatically. He only had 55 seats, and the opposition had, I don't recall exactly how many it was. But
yeah, no, he lost those elections in Parliament.
Yeah.
That's why Juan Guaido was able to pronounce himself as interim president, because that was agreed by the Constitution and by all of our laws. Because Maduro had gone to 2018 elections, no one recognized him, and therefore he was announced as interim president. All that happened. Right now, the parliament is back controlled by the regime, and it's not just the legislative branch; it's also the judicial branch. It's also the electoral branch. It's also the military branch. So the issue with Venezuela is that there is no separation of powers. There's no independence of powers. So Maduro and Chavez back in his time have control all over these powers. And while they do that, that's why the regime works in its ways. That's why it's impossible to have justice. That's why it's impossible for respect for human rights. That's why it's impossible for respect for private companies. Let's not forget that Chavez nationalized millions, like so many companies at this time, and he practically eradicated the private industry under this idea of socialism of the 21st century. But none of these private companies have been able to get any kind of retribution, or it's not like Chavez decided to pay for their assets, because there is no justice, there's no legal system in place. There's no rule of law. So that's why it's been so complex for the Venezuelans to come back to democracy, because they absolutely control everything. And they've made all of these institutions part of the cartel of sons and part of this drug trafficking industry. And that's why they all have economic interests at heart. They all want the revenue at the end of the day. And that's why it's been so hard to displace them and to oust them, because it's more than just, it's so much more than just corruption. It's really creating a state in which the people in the highest ranks have just as much to lose if Maduro would lose. And that's why they are so kind of like together, and that they're so much ingrained. But it's impossible to get basic respect for human rights if you have a regime in that state. So.
Yeah, and I just thought of something really quick too. That it's interesting you say human rights, because there's an international acceptance of what human rights is, particularly right in the West. And I was just thinking about Iran. It's just something that's always on my mind, given my experience and my time in the Middle East. But there's an argument to be had with those that live in Iran, those that are very conservative, particularly religious conservative Shias, that human rights is a subjective term, because the religion provides for some behaviors that we in the West wouldn't necessarily consider to be appropriate. Let's just put it that way. But that's not the case in Venezuela, right? 92% of the people that live in Venezuela are Christian, and the vast majority of them are Catholic. And so they have that connection between what we would consider moral and ethical behavior in the United States. And so it's shocking to me that given that human rights issue and how we would agree in the West that all of these things that are not good down in Venezuela, that we don't do more to change that. Let me try to be a little more clear. One of the reasons why some people argue against making regime change in Iran is that they do things that we don't necessarily think is right, but that's not necessarily the case for everybody in Iran. They think their behavior is different, right? And their standards are different. But that wouldn't be the case in Venezuela, right? I mean, the vast majority of people are at least identify as Christian.
Yeah, and take off the religious factor into it. Maduro has the biggest torture center of the Western Hemisphere in Caracas, Venezuela, which is called El Helicoide, which has tons of political prisoners. As I said before, he's already incarcerated over 2,000 political prisoners. And that's the biggest torture center of the Western Hemisphere. That's why he is going under investigation for crimes against humanity. Like, take away the religious aspect of it. He is killing people just because killing and torturing people because they think differently than him, because they want a different political outcome, because they're journalists, because they're kids who were protesting, so that's where I go back to the United States responsibility to protect kind of principle, right? How far are we going to let him continue to do this? How far are we willing to go for him to? I mean, I was seeing videos the other day of the mothers just standing in front of these torture centers, just waiting to see if they are allowed to go in to see their kids, and they've been not. It's 158 kids who are in jail at the moment. So I think I would take off the religious kind of like aspect to it, just to understand that this is really human rights. And these are not stories that Alex can tell. Like, many of my friends have been tortured in El Helicoide. Many people that I know have been tortured in other centers across Venezuela, and it's just part of their state policy to torture and to oust and to remove anyone who thinks differently. So,
and I will say, what's that?
No, let's see how long the international community is willing to let him continue. So, yeah,
well, I will say that having conversations like this with yourself, who have dealt with the ills of socialism, and at least the way that Maduro and Chavez understand it, and is disheartening for me, because there's a lot of political discourse in the United States, and this isn't really a question, more of a statement, I guess. But the political discourse in the United States, where both sides are calling the other side fascist, and then the other side says,
right,
no, you're a socialist and whatever. And it's like, now, the American people really need to understand what that means, right? I mean, Maduro is a socialist in his mindset, and so was Chavez, and that has led to what we're currently seeing in Venezuela. Now, on top of personal greed and all these other things, clearly it's not just the economic foundation, or the economic framework rather, but it's just disheartening to hear. It's just how like Americans want to subsume that language and say, yeah, it's just as bad here. You're a socialist like everybody else. And they have no idea how good they have it, right? Like, we don't have issues. We had such an issue with January 6th, and we had such an issue when President Trump decided that he wasn't going to leave, but he ultimately left, because it was so crazy to Americans that we wouldn't have a peaceful transfer of power when somebody just decided, well, listen, I just lost this thing, I got to get out of here. It's just, again,
to give you another example to make it crazier for Americans, all media in Venezuela is controlled by Maduro. TV stations, radio stations, all of them. So imagine not having the possibility to choose between Fox or CNN or BBC or MSNBC. Like, all of them are controlled by his narrative and by his political communicational kind of policy, and all of them are controlled by the regime. And a lot of what we find is that a lot of what we're learning about Venezuela has to happen through social media. And that's why a lot of people have taken social media, and social media has increased so much in Venezuela, because it's the only way to show a video, or to show a reel, or to show a picture of anything that's happening. And just having like very small digital independent outlets that are practically being crowdsourced in order for people to get the information that they need. So just to give you another example of how crazy it is, and it's also human rights, but it's also rights for freedom of expression and everything else. None of that is allowed within this dictatorship. So,
now, one quick question I had too is I had read that one of the ways that Chavez was able to, obviously pre-Maduro, was able to garner the support of the people after his coup in '99, that he did provide for the poor. He did take from the wealthy. He did remove some of the corrupt leadership that was there. And so he had popular support, if you will, from the poor, who were at least getting stuff. They were getting food, they were getting other things. Is that still happening today? Is Maduro at least holding on to some semblance of support from that element of society because he's continuing to give, or is it just, are we just now in a complete like gangsterism where he only takes care of the people that are taking care of him, and that's it?
He takes care of the people that are only taking care of him. And when there are opportunities for him to give something to the people in these social welfare programs, if you ask me, they're totally irresponsible because there is no actual policy behind them or funding behind them. Just the other day, I was hearing in the news that he's giving people expired food, or he's importing food from Iran that also expires, and he's just letting it rot, and that's what he gives to the people. So the people are not taking anything from him anymore because they know what his intentions are. They know that he just wants to stay in power, and all those social welfare programs are just backfiring on him at the moment because he lost the election. Like, people are so open of like, hey, you have to go. I'm not going to receive any more of your money or welfare or medicine programs, or like, none of that makes sense anymore. People are absolutely clear that they don't want Maduro.
And so they get most of their information, I assume, the truthful information from the internet, right? So they're not believing all of the state media where he claims he is the legitimate president. And the vast majority of people are like, no, the United States and the rest of the West and Britain, they all say that, you're a knucklehead and you're in here for illegitimate reasons. And they believe that, and they get it filtered through all of these other news channels. Is that how that happens?
Yeah. The people are getting information through social media. People are getting information through WhatsApp. The complexity now is that the regime and police officers from the regime can stop you in the middle of a highway, or can stop you in in any mall that you're walking through, or stop you in any block that you're on and ask you for your phone. And if they see things of the opposition, and if they see things of Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, if they see something against the government, you will go to jail. So now it's, once again, terrorism of state. Now, every time you leave home, you better clean up your phone and make sure that there is no news or no history or no nothing that goes against the regime, because if someone stops you in the middle of the street and they get your phone and they take you to jail, that's where you're going to remain. So it's that complex. And that's why the diaspora, the 8 million people of us who are outside of the country, really take seriously the explanation of what's happening in Venezuela. And that's why I take this podcast and any other podcast and any other news outlet, because it's our responsibility, the people who are outside of Venezuela, to actually explain what's happening, because it's even becoming more harder for Venezuelans to get the information that they need on a daily basis. So.
Yeah. Oh, unbelievable. Well, listen, Alex, I really appreciate you taking the time today. This is so enlightening. I guess I'll just ask you one more thing. Like, what, if there's one thing that you can leave me and the people that are listening with, on top of whatever you have already revealed and we've discussed here, so we can become better educated, what would that be?
It would be that on July 28th, Maduro lost his presidential election. And I say lost because Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, who's the opposition candidate, won by 70%. He only got 30% of the votes. Despite of not being able to show that he won, he decided to declare himself the winner. And he has all the intentions of staying in power and of creating, and he already has created a bloodbath of Venezuelans who are now in jail or who have been killed because of these elections. And I think the most important thing that people have to take away with is that the Venezuelans chose a new leader. The Venezuelans are ready for democracy, and that we need the international community to make sure that there's a peaceful transition in January to allow Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia and Maria Corina Machado to take power and to start a new chapter of Venezuela. And Venezuelans are ready to go back home if that happens. So that would be my key takeaway of today.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for explaining, Alex.
Happy to.
Again, this has been great. And so many of the listeners have been looking forward to this. We've been talking about it for a month now. So this is fantastic. And I'm sure we're going to get some great feedback, and potentially they're going to ask that we're going to have Alex back on in the future. And I hope you'd be willing to do it. I'm sure he would be. If not, then I'll just twist Pat's arm and we'll get you back on the show. But anyways, listen, get back to what you're doing this weekend, spending time with the family and all those things. Thanks so much for joining us. And I just really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you.